before the British raised their flag, before Captain Cook became the name every schoolchild learned, before maps were redrawn, borders were declared, and history was written from the deck of European ships. Strange sails were already appearing on Australia's northern horizon. They came out of the mist. They came with the monsoon winds. They crossed dangerous waters from Asia, steering wooden boats across the Timor Sea toward a land that many people today were taught was completely cut off from the rest of the world. But Australia was not silent. Australia was not waiting. And the people on those northern shores were not lost, primitive, or unknown. They were watching. They saw the sails. They heard the voices. They smelled the smoke from foreign cooking fires. And over time, something began between them that still troubles the simple version of history. A connection, a trade, a memory, maybe even bloodlines. So the question is not only who came to Australia before the British? The deeper question is this: why are we not told? For centuries, the story of Australia has often been told as if the outside world arrived with Europe. The British came. The British saw. The British named. The British claimed. That is the clean version, the comfortable version. But history is rarely clean, and the northern coast of Australia holds a different truth. A truth shaped by salt water, smoke, hunger, language, ceremony, and the dangerous pull of the sea. Long before the British colonies were built in the south and east, another group of visitors came again and again to the north. They were not British. They were not Dutch settlers. They were not missionaries. They were seafarers from Macassan in Sulawesi, now part of Indonesia. They are remembered today as the Macassans. And they did not come looking for empty land. They came looking for something hidden beneath the waves. Something strange, something soft, something that looked almost worthless to people who did not understand its power. Sea cucumber, also called trepang. To most people, it may sound like a strange creature from the mud of the ocean floor. But in the old Asian trading world, trepang was valuable. It could be dried, processed, carried across great distances, and sold into powerful markets. It was food. It was medicine. It was wealth. And for the Macassans, the northern coast of Australia was not the edge of nowhere. It was a place of opportunity, a place marked by reefs, tides, beaches, and sea country full of life. So season after season, when the winds were right, their boats moved south. Imagine it, the sky dark with monsoon clouds, the sea swelling under wooden hulls. Men praying, steering, watching the stars, knowing one mistake could send them into deep water forever. They were crossing a dangerous border, not drawn on any map, but written in waves and storm clouds. And somewhere ahead, beyond the gray line of the ocean, the Australian coast waited. But when they arrived, they did not find an empty shore. They found people, Aboriginal people who knew every inlet, every river mouth, every season, every spirit place, every law of the land and sea. The Macassans had ships, but the people of the coast had country, and that changed everything. This was not a simple story of strangers walking onto abandoned beaches. It was contact. It was negotiation. It was caution. It was curiosity. It was danger. Because the first meeting between two worlds is never simple. Think of that moment. A wooden prow moving toward the shore. Smoke rising from an Aboriginal camp. Eyes watching from the trees. Foreign men stepping onto the sand with cloth, metal, tobacco, rice, knives, and words no one on the shore had heard before. And the people of the coast deciding what to do. Do you run? Do you fight? Do you watch? Do you trade? Do you test the strangers and see what they want? That first silence must have carried weight, because both sides knew something powerful was happening. The Macassans needed access to the coast. They needed places to land. They needed water, firewood, labor, and knowledge of where to find and process trepang. The Aboriginal communities knew the shore. They knew the waters. They knew the rules. Nothing could happen there without entering a world already full of meaning. So relationships formed. Not perfect relationships. Not simple relationships. But real ones. There was trade. There was work. There was exchange. There were gifts. There were misunderstandings. There may have been conflict. There may have been friendship. And slowly, something deeper began to move between the two worlds. Words. A word can outlive a ship. A word can survive when buildings disappear, when flags change, when old men die, and when official history forgets. And in parts of northern Australia, especially in Arnhem Land, traces of Macassan contact survived in Aboriginal languages. Words connected to boats, trade, tools, cloth, tobacco, foreign objects, foreign people. These are not just sounds. They were fingerprints. Every borrowed word tells us something. It tells us people spoke face to face. It tells us they worked together. It tells us they pointed, asked, laughed, argued, learned, and remembered. A borrowed word is not created by distance. It is created by contact. And that is where the story becomes harder to bury. Because if the Macassans only came once, the memory might have faded. If they only landed briefly, there would be little trace. But the evidence says something else. This was not one lost boat. This was not one accidental meeting. For generations, Macassan trepangers came to northern Australia with the monsoon. They built camps. They processed trepang. They boiled it, smoked it, dried it, loaded it. Then they carried it back across the sea. And the people of the northern coast watched this rhythm return again and again. The sea became a road. The horizon became a door. And Australia, which many later imagined as isolated, was part of a much wider world. But then comes the question hidden inside the title of this story. Did the Macassans leave DNA behind? This is where we must be careful, because the truth is more powerful than a cheap exaggeration. Aboriginal Australians did not come from the Macassans. Their ancestry is far older, far deeper. It reaches back tens of thousands of years, in one of the longest continuous human stories on Earth. So the mystery is not whether the Macassans created Aboriginal identity. They did not. They speak of connections that did not fit neatly into British paperwork. And that is the unsettling part. The old colonial story, maybe in a name passed down quietly, maybe in a bloodline that no colonial officer understood or wanted to understand. This is why the phrase secret Asian DNA grabs attention. But the deeper truth is bigger than biology. It is not only genetic DNA. It is cultural DNA, historical DNA, ocean DNA, the hidden code of contact that lived in songs, ceremonies, languages, tools, and stories. And once you see it, Australia no longer looks like a sealed island waiting for Europe. It looks like what it always was. The myth that Aboriginal people were isolated from the wider world until Europe broke the silence. But the Macassan story breaks that myth. It shows that northern Aboriginal communities were not cut off from everything beyond the shore. They were part of a living world of exchange. They knew foreign visitors. They made choices. They negotiated. They adapted. They remembered. And that changes the emotional weight of the whole Australian story. Because if the British were not the first outsiders to form contact, then the question becomes uncomfortable. Why did their version become the main version? The answer is power. The people who control records often control memory. The British wrote reports. They drew maps. They built institutions. They made laws. They decided what counted as history and what became a footnote. But Aboriginal memory did not need British permission to survive. It lived in oral history. It lived in place names. It lived in art. It lived in ceremony. It lived in the way elders spoke about the boats from the north. And when you listen to those memories, you begin to hear a different Australia. Not empty, not silent, not waiting, but watching the horizon. For the Macassans, the journey itself must have carried spiritual weight. These were not easy trips. They were crossing open sea in wooden vessels, guided by wind, stars, inherited knowledge, and courage. Every voyage carried risk. Storms could tear the sky open. Reefs could break a hull. Sickness could take men far from home. And behind them, in Sulawesi, families waited for fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers to return. Ahead of them was a foreign coast with its own laws, its own spirits, its own guardians, its own dangers. They were not entering an empty resource zone. They were entering country, and country remembers. Picture a Macassan camp on the coast at night. The trepang fires burning low. Smoke drifting into the dark. Aboriginal workers nearby, watching, speaking, trading. Foreign prayers carried on the wind. Local songs rising from the land. Two worlds close enough to touch, yet separated by language, law, and mystery. Now ask yourself, how could centuries of that leave nothing behind? It cannot. Something always remains. Sometimes it is a scar. Sometimes it is a gift. Sometimes it is a word. Sometimes it is a story a grandmother tells when the official books stay quiet. And then, just as this ocean road had opened, it began to close. The end did not come because the sea forgot the way. It came because colonial power moved in. Regulations, taxes, borders, new laws, new authorities deciding who could enter, who could trade, who could cross, who could belong. The old movement between Sulawesi and Northern Australia became harder, then restricted, then stopped. The boats that had once come with the monsoon faded from the horizon. Imagine what that meant. For generations, people had expected the sails. They had seen the same seasonal rhythm. Arrival, work, trade, departure, return. Then, one year, fewer boats came. Then fewer. Then almost none. The horizon changed. The sea road closed. And with it, living relationships were cut. Not by nature, not by forgetting, but by a new world of colonial borders. This is one of the saddest parts of the story. Because when outsiders talk about history, they often talk as if contact is only an event. A date. A landing. A discovery. But for the people living through it, contact is not an event. It is a relationship. It is someone who arrives every season. It is a trader you know, a word you learn, a tool you use, a song you remember, a father who crosses the sea, a child who asks where he came from, a coastline that once looked north with expectation. And then one day, the boats are gone, but the memory stays. Today, the Macassan story still survives in Northern Australia. It survives in the way some communities speak about the past. It survives in art that shows boats with high sails. It survives in old knowledge of trepang camps. It survives in songs and dances. It survives in relationships between Aboriginal people and people from Indonesia who recognize that the sea between them was not always a wall. It was once a path. That is the revelation. The sea was not a barrier. The sea was a bridge. And this bridge existed before the British made their claims. Before modern borders. Before Australia and Indonesia were imagined the way they are today. Before colonial history tried to flatten a complicated past into a simple beginning. The Macassans did not come to Australia as conquerors in the British sense. They did not build a colony. They did not replace the ancient owners of the land. They came for trepang. They came for trade. But human beings never carry only one thing. They carried language. They carried faith. They carried customs. They carried hunger. They carried stories. They carried desire. They carried fear. They carried memories of home. And when they left, some part of them remained. The official history may have looked past it, but the coast did not. The coast held the evidence. In the sand, in the words, in the memories, in the families, in the quiet knowledge that Australia's past is not as simple as many were taught. And maybe that is why this story feels almost forbidden, not because it is fantasy, but because it disturbs the neat timeline. It reminds us that history did not begin when Europeans started writing it down. It reminds us that Aboriginal people were never just background figures in someone else's discovery story. They were decision makers, traders, owners, witnesses, interpreters, workers, cultural keepers, and survivors of many worlds arriving at their shores. The Macassan story also reminds us that Asia and Australia were never completely separate. Look at the map. Northern Australia does not face Europe. It faces the islands of Southeast Asia. It faces Timor, Sulawesi, Indonesia. The winds know this. The currents know this. The birds know this. The old sailors knew this. But for a long time, Many history books acted as if Australia's most important direction was always west, toward Britain. The Macassan story turns the map around. It asks us to look north, to the sea, to the old routes, to the people who crossed before the empire arrived. And when we do that, something powerful happens. The story of Australia becomes wider, older, more connected, more human, and more unsettling. Because it means some of the things people called new were not new. Contact was not new. Trade was not new. Foreign arrival was not new. The British were not entering a world untouched by outsiders. They were entering a land with its own ancient law, and in the north, a coastline that already knew the shape of foreign sails. So who were the Macassans before the British arrived? They were sailors, traders, trepangers, Muslims from the Indonesian world, men of the monsoon, men who crossed a dangerous sea for a creature hidden under the water, men who entered Aboriginal sea country and became part of a complicated relationship that lasted for generations. They were not the center of Aboriginal history, but they became part of it. They were not the origin of Indigenous Australia, but they left traces inside the story. And those traces matter, because sometimes the most powerful history is not the history written in capital cities. Sometimes it is the history whispered by the shore, the history carried in a borrowed word, the history painted in the shape of a boat, the history remembered in a family, the history that waits until someone finally asks the right question. And that question is not just, were Asians in Australia before the British? The answer is yes, in the north through Macassan contact. The deeper question is, what else was hidden when colonial history became the loudest voice? Because if this chapter was pushed aside, how many others were pushed aside with it? How many ocean roads have we forgotten? How many indigenous memories were treated as legend until outsiders finally admitted they were history? How many connections were erased because they did not fit the story empires wanted to tell? The Macassan story is not just about sea cucumber. It is about memory. It is about power. It is about who gets called the first, who gets called the discoverer, who gets written into books, and who is left standing on the shore, knowing the truth long before the world is ready to hear it. So the next time someone says Australia was isolated before Europe, remember the northern horizon. Remember the wooden boats. Remember the smoke from trepang fires. Remember the Aboriginal people watching, negotiating, trading, and remembering. Remember that the sea was alive with movement. And remember that long before the British flag rose over Australian soil, another story had already arrived with the wind. A story from Asia. A story from Arnhem Land. A story of salt, smoke, and silence. A story still waiting to be fully understood. The Macassans were not a footnote. They were evidence. Evidence that Australia's past is bigger than the version many people were given. Evidence that the first chapters of Contact were not written only in English. Evidence that the land and sea remember what official history tried to simplify. And maybe that is the real secret. Not that Australia had one hidden Asian connection, but that Australia was always connected in ways that empire did not want to see. Long before the British came with flags and maps, the Macassans came with sails and fire. They met Aboriginal people not as shadows in an empty land, but as owners of country, keepers of law, and guardians of the coast. And when the boats stopped coming, the truth did not disappear. It waited. In language, in memory, in ceremony, in families, in the coastline itself. If this story changed the way you see Australian history, subscribe, because in the next video, we will uncover another forgotten chapter from the ancient sea routes between Indigenous Australia and Southeast Asia. And tell me in the comments, should schools teach the Macassan story as part of Australia's real first contact history?